is the first part. We are here with the 15th intellectual dialogue about the potential of visual arts in contemporary global context. We're going to go further, and all the introduction will be happen on today's session. We're going to have the presentation, two parts of presentation with our speaker. Also, and the second part, after each part of the presentation, we're going to have the dialogue session. There's a short and the second part. But let's start with first the introduction of the group about Ottawa Intellectual Dialogue. This group kind of started about a year ago, and the participants mostly at the beginning, I can say the grassroots, were the students of Ottawa University mainly, and also other universities of all around Canada. As we can see today, they are experts. I cannot say all the students, but experts from different fields of study and from different universities all around Canada. So how we go about these sessions, just a kind of introduction to how we are going to perform. First of all, our vision, Ottawa Intellectual Dialogue vision is to create a public sphere in which we can build trust, dialogue, and the audacity to question the way we think, to question things that we find even maybe obvious to us. So this is the first part, and in this way, what we need in our dialogue is actually, better to start with this sentence. There's a sentence that we all have heard, seems so familiar, but still it works. That if you want to give a fish, you feed them just a day. But if you teach people to fish, so that's a lifetime that you can help them. This is why these sessions are done. So we are here to define and select the current fundamental questions and definition, enhance our way of communication, as we said, to build the trust, involvement, respect, and understanding each other's points of view. And in order to reach this goal, we want to follow scientific, rational, and reliable methods. So the roadmap is there to follow. So, and the base route is just to dare to ask, dare to question. So people here are from different fields of study. Each one of us has our own points of view. So we are here to share, and that is the beauty of it, I think. The way we conduct, actually the way of communication, just a kind of heads up, is we try to follow the three Eric Burns kind of TA, if we can call it. They are three states of ego states: parents, adults, and child. I think we are mostly familiar with that. So we try not to be, actually in the dialogue part, not to be like, for example, parent, child. We want the communication, the questions, and the expressions to be more into adult relationship, so that there can be a kind of dialogue happening over there. So, and also something else that I think it's good to remind ourselves and in the sessions is we want to, and we try to, better to say, to follow some kind of rhizomatic model in the dialogue. It means what we follow in our dialogues and all the questions and answer is to build space, kind of secure and safe space in which they won't be, or at least we want to reduce as much as we can, the non-hierarchical relationship. And also, as people are from different walks of life, and actually people are from multidisciplinary fields, so we are here to draw a line and to connect kind of genuinely and know each other's points of view. We want to develop a network of multidisciplinary interconnections and not just one narrative, linear narrative. Also, we are here to learn, and as we experience and as we experience consciously, better to say, the dialogue and the process of the dialogue. We want to reform our existing mentality by what remains in us. Actually, the byproduct of these sessions are what we reach and the changes and the reforms that we get after the end of the sessions. The other parts that we need in the question parts especially is active listening. Seems familiar, but just we want to review about the factors that are needed in the active listening is first of all means totally being here in the sessions, listening and being there emotionally, also following up and following verbally or non-verbally the communication parts. We want to ask open question. It means that we don't want to ask kind of question that we stop answering and there won't be any answer to be given, kind of the dead end of communication. We don't want to get there. Also, we want to make sure that we encourage ourselves and encourage each other in the process of asking question and daring in a way. And also silences, sometimes they are underestimated, but powerful they are in their being. We want to follow them too and have them as when it is needed, better to say. The other part is about reflecting on each other. So we want to make sure that we understand the messages, content, feelings properly. So we try to think about them, paraphrase for ourselves, and then go forward, and also reflected listening. And the last part, the last but not the least, better to say, is inputting, where we realize that just listening and reflecting will not solve. We would share and we would add our point of view and what we think can be kind of help to the clarification of the idea. So this was the general way that we go, in a way that is actually the sessions are actually performed. There is a subject selected and an email is sent with possible references, general references, and some introduction to the topic to all the participants before the session, before the date of session. During the one, we have an expert, most of the time expert or scholar in any area that we have the sessions who present the subject. They have 2 short presentations about 30 to 50 minutes. And after each part of the presentation, there is dialogue and questions and answer, and better to say dialogue. So in this part, if you have any, if you want to open a conversation or have a general dialogue, you will ask for 2 minutes. You can show with your hands and the actually video, you can show it. And if there is any comment, any short comments in any of the dialogue and those general comments, please use the hands with 3, which is 30 seconds to add some comments on it. So, and at the end, as always, we have some conclusion and reach the point. These parts are about the topics, reasons that Aleppo intellectual dialogue has covered so far. So there have been 2 seasons and about human and knowledge and the ways of acquiring knowledge, consisting 14 seasons. And also the topics are all here. And here there are ways to contact us. Aleppo Intellectual Dialogue has a Facebook page, Telegram channel, and also an email. The email address, you have it on the screen, but it is aleppointellectualdialogue@gmail.com. And also you can always contact and find us on social media, as at Facebook and Telegram. We would be more than happy to receive any emails, any proposals or any ideas regarding the sessions. And now we reach to the point for today. So today our guest speaker is Ms. Nanderia Fitzpatrick, who is the Associate Professor and Associate Professor of Department of Visual Art at the University of Ottawa. And Andrea Fitzpatrick, PhD, is an art historian, associate professor, and member of the Institute of Feminist and Gender Studies at the University of Ottawa, and has published widely on contemporary art. In 2012, they guest curated 2 exhibitions of Iranian lens-based gender and exposure, which was at Toronto Gallery 44, and ciphers at Ottawa's SAW Gallery. So her past presentations and publication involve the photographic art of Parastu Ahadi and also Sadegh Tirafkan. And research is focused on decolonizing methodologies for the study of art from the global south, histories of conflict, trauma, mourning, and resistance in the contemporary art of Iran. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to invite Andrea Fitzpatrick. Thank you very much for joining us today, and the ground is yours, please.
Thank you.
I stop sharing, and the rest is yours.
Thank you so much. Let me see how to do a new share. Do you want to?
There's if you just scroll down, just next to chat box, there is a share screen.
Okay. Yes.
And as you press it, you can go toward that. Yes, it is shared now.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks to the Ottawa Intellectual Dialogues Group, in particular, Dr. Majid Naji and Pershang Saleh for inviting me, and for Dr. Naji's support and interest in my research for over 10 years, and for fostering a profound bridge between the Iranian intellectual community in Ottawa, including the Iranian Students' Societies of U Ottawa and Carleton, and the Visual Arts Department at the University of Ottawa. Some of the students are here, and I'm really happy to see you, which includes artists both here and from Iran. The concept of these talks, as explained to me by Dr. Naji, involving interdisciplinary dialogues between experts and researchers, couldn't be more compelling and timely because of the increasing polarization and fragmentation of those whose worldviews, scientific views, and political views hinder so many forms of cultural, economic, and humanitarian progress, stability, and even civility. Being able to engage respectfully with others despite differences of language, culture, race, religion, ability, and class is more urgent than ever in every corner of the world, even in Canada, despite often being held as a leader in peace, diversity, and human rights. Every single day, the news greets us with senseless acts of violence on small and large scales, as well as state-sponsored and engineered plans for the suppression of human rights and civil liberties, colonization, displacement, occupation, and genocide. As the description of this talk suggests, the potential of contemporary art in the global context, the view I, as well as many others, have of contemporary art is rather lofty, even utopian, that its highest calling or greatest potential is to address the difficult issues mentioned above, involving the nation state's use of excessive force to exterminate its perceived ethnic others or its political opponents, and the suffering, murder, and exile of generations, and the subsequent legacies of trauma, loss, and irreversible absence that ensue. So before I begin part one of these presentations, I'll just let you know that after the break, because I know people may not have a lot of time, but if you want to know what I'll be speaking about after the break, it's a huge series called the Tripping Stones, or Stolpersteine in German, which is a project that memorializes the victims of the Holocaust in Europe. And that's based on field research that I've done over quite a few years. So that would be after the break. But first we turn to sunnier, warmer climates and art as seen at the Louvre Museum here in Abu Dhabi on the screen, in order to introduce some fundamentals of art historical research and methodologies, which involves a close consideration of formal qualities. And by this, I mean shapes, colors, and forms, as well as mediums, sculpture versus painting, for example, and how these elements can convey cultural messages and be in dialogue not only with viewers, but with each other. Turning to the Louvre Museum in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, we may consider some of the ideas you may remember in the lecture poster, such as the ability of art to speak across different cultures, languages, and historic eras. We may also consider here, by studying the formal qualities of these two series of artworks, and these are the ones I'll be discussing in a moment, not only how the forms and colors themselves transmit meaning, images, and ideas, but also how the artworks were chosen by the Louvre Museum's curators to connect to this location, offering an example of a concept we will hear be repeated this evening, which is called site specificity, or a particular connection of the artworks to a particular location or site. And by site, I don't mean visual site, but location. We will also appreciate the inspired work of the Louvre curators in their selection of artworks that speak to emotions and cultural sensibilities without ever resorting to a particular national language. The dazzling virtuoso architecture of the Abu Dhabi Louvre, designed by French architect Jean Nouvel and completed in 2008, sits right on the blindingly sunny blue waterways that separate the UAE from Iran, which is just to the north. We'll go back here. The tent-like metal canopy, a parasol or convex, circular, some have said it's like a mashrabiyah, the Islamic architectural or decorative device used in domestic and other architecture that looks like a screen, floating sideways as if covering the museum. And the museum itself exists in a number of fragmented gallery spaces situated close to each other as if an ancient city or Medina, with labyrinthine passages shaded under this tent-like geometric metal roof. It offers a large amount of shade and breezes that flow from over the piers and that are attached to it, jutting out into the water. The layers of interlocking triangular aluminum shapes recall the sacred geometric designs that articulate the interior of domes of Islamic architecture. However, it's actually not the architecture here that I'd like to discuss, but rather the first gallery that greets the visitor to this epic destination. According to the museum, the painting series that you see here by the artist Cy Twombly, and his first name is spelled here on the screen, Cy, last name is Twombly, lining the walls of the first gallery one enters, quote, introduces the public to the maritime architecture and luminous calligraphy of the museum and invites them to surrender to the emotion of the discovery of civilizations in this living light. That's from the complete guide to the Abu Dhabi Louvre, end quote. The American artist Cy Twombly, who lived from 1928 to 2011, who worked and lived in the United States as well as Italy, is known for sculpture and painting. These are not his sculptures. We're just looking at Cy Twombly's paintings. But it is his paintings that garnered most critical study. They are on the cusp of two eras in art history: late modernism, evident in the large scale, the use of painting as medium, and they're gestural abstract expressionists, the evidence of the hand moving, as well as they're on the cusp of another era in art history, which we call postmodernism. And for that reason, it's again because of the painting medium, or what has been called a reactionary return to painting, even after newer, more politically engaged and critical explorations of other mediums contemporaneous to this work, created well after the apparent exhaustion of modernism's tenets. The postmodern categorization has also been claimed because of the painting's allegorical mode, their modes of conveying meaning with recourse to multiple images and through multiple, often extraneous narratives. Their allegorical mode is most clearly perceived in their references to text. Let's see, okay. Although the text is never legible in Twombly's work, it's more of a, quote, pseudo writing, end quote, in the artist's words, or in the museum's words, an quote, emotional calligraphy, end quote. The painting's quasi-representational mode, in other words, their possible depiction of something recognizable, exists as well in their cobalt blue color, emphatically suggesting the waterways just outside the windows and geometric screens that frame a view of them. So I'll just go back here. So when we're walking through the hallways of the museum, we can look through the windows that are framed by these geometric contemporary forms, perhaps of, you could call them mashrabiyah, or screens, and you can see the water. It's right there outside the museum. So surely the paintings relate to this. Also, their calligraphic swirls and clearly site-specific imagery exists in multiple ways. They might reference Arabic or Farsi writing of the region, as well as the sacred manuscripts that might exist, well, that do exist in the museum's collection. The buoyant, surging, irregular ovals of white paint, looped rhythmically with ever-increasing size from top to bottom, also suggest the ripples on the surface of a wind-swept sea, even the continuous movement and cascade of foam-tipped waves upon a shoreline. These forms speak to the site, to the Gulf geographic context, and to various languages written in the region, not only Arabic and Farsi, but many other cultures further east in which writing in calligraphic form is practiced. And so this references the cosmopolitan visitors to the museum and the works in the collection. The significance of the blue or lapis lazuli color cannot be overstated because Twombly's work looks and feels very different when another color is chosen. As the installation, I can come back to these, as the installation of some of his paintings at the Tate Modern Museum in London demonstrates, using red paint swirls on a white ground, with all of the energetic, passionate, violent associations conveyed by the crimson color and the juicy, bloody drips, quite evident when the loops are enlarged to fill the entire height of these expansive canvases. The comparison of red with blue is perhaps so obvious to people in art and art research as to be a cliche, but it is effective for our purposes to illustrate the power of color as well as scale and shape. The title of these works from London are called Untitled Bacchus. The red and white work in the Tate Modern, here, we're no longer dealing with the type of meditative serenity of lapping waves or the scrawling dynamism of enlightened poetic or sacred writing. It's a completely different effect. Although it could be argued that the enormous circles of red loops function in a playful way, there is also a sense of repetition compulsion and urgency there, with the tendrils of dripping paint resembling a crime scene. The comparison allows us to see the way the Louvre curators, we'll go back. The comparison allows us to see the way the Louvre curators so well selected the works for this particular display to emphasize coolness, civility, the surrounding water, and possibly also various global forms of literacy. Imagine how the red paintings would look here. Alarming and out of place, to say the least, and I won't bother to enumerate the Islamophobic stereotypes that may emerge from such a choice, not in the eyes of visitors from the region, but perhaps from international tourists from Europe and North America in particular, who regularly suffer such media cliches linking Islam with violence. Moreover, the frenzy and wine drinking associated with the Greco-Roman god Bacchus wouldn't be appropriate for the Muslim majority region anyway. Now to return, there is also an important curatorial choice to consider with the dialogue established between the ultra-contemporary paintings and the ancient rock sculptures, which depict faces, possibly masks or axes and spears, and some hands. I hope people can see that. There's another face here, possibly a mask. Here a face or a mask, and a spear or an axe. These are engraved on the rock in low relief. These are from Saudi Arabia, which is adjacent to the United Arab Emirates, where Abu Dhabi is located, and are dated from about 2000 before Common Era. But the tradition exists as early as the Neolithic era and extends to the early Islamic period, which, according to the dates of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, would date to roughly 600 Common Era. So they've existed for a long time. And the carvings are attributed to the nomadic shepherds of the region and may indicate tribal status. Because there are so many sites with examples of these rock carvings or rock decorations, at least 1,500 in the region, they comprise what the Louvre calls open-air museums. Brought indoors to this rarefied white space, decontextualized from their original site, where they may have been used as markers of some sort, with their possible signaling and territorial purposes. Please forgive my lack of expertise on these ancient works. They were new to me upon visiting the museums. We are reminded of the non-utilitarian notion of art, which modern Western culture invented only in the last 2 to 3 centuries. The rock face images seem chosen by the curators to indicate the continued dialogues across vast expanses of time that art, or what we now consider as art, can foster. Most striking of which involves a fundamental dichotomy inherent to modern art in the Western tradition, and visual art students will be familiar with this. This dichotomy or difference is the tension between abstraction and representation. So here we would consider this abstract, and here, because it references forms that we could possibly identify and recognize, we consider this representation. And if we want to be even more specific, if we are looking at referencing the human figure, we can call this figuration. So this is a fundamental difference in way of categorizing what we see in visual art. Is it, in the modern era, is it abstract or does it represent something? Is it abstract or representational? Abstract or figurative? So we have that dialogue here among opposites, and it's surprising that the abstraction is from the newer work, the much newer work, and the ancient work is where we see the figuration, the depiction of human life and tools. The meanings that emerge due to the choices of the museum curators seem provocative, possibly in this regard. Are the curators making a statement here about the prior existence of figuration multiple millennia before the arrival of Islam and its dictates against representing humans in pictures, without attributing impossible to prove political motives to the curators? We can at least perceive the recognition of very long-standing human impulses to communicate with recognizable forms, and the long existence in the Arabian Peninsula of peoples with artistic and conceptual abilities and traditions. The knowledge of these rock carvings itself challenges the Eurocentrism and West centrism of the art history canon as it is written and taught in English. Whether these figures are meant to be read as humans or as deities, I cannot say, as it's out of my area of expertise, as I mentioned. But in any case, their collision in the museum gallery ignites a dialogue across millennia, across cultures, between a classic dichotomy of forms, abstraction versus figuration, as well as sea versus land, the nebulous or flowing versus the solid and immutable, etc., etc. You can keep finding points of tension and contrast and dialogue. Okay. In order to continue the discussion of materials in art and how they so powerfully and surprisingly convey multiple ideas across time, we move to Tiananmen Square in China with the work of Dong Song, who in 1996 conducted a 45-minute experiment that we can categorize, or we do categorize now, as performance art on a cold winter evening. He did this to see if his own repeated, determined puffs of breath would create some frost if repeatedly exhaled while he was lying face down on the slabs of tile in the middle of the legendary Imperial Plaza or Square, which is also a tourist site and the nexus of communist political display for many decades. Song was accompanied by a few graduate students who documented the performance with a camera. And despite the sensitive and surveilled nature of the plaza, especially since 1989, with the pro-democracy protests and subsequent massacres that occurred there, it was rather risky to do this experiment in this way. The artist and his assistants were in fact interrupted by police and questioned, but after explaining the artistic nature of the pursuit, they were not arrested or interrogated further. As with the use of symbolic artistic materials and a significant site to convey meaning, the artist here doesn't need a poster or a placard or a sign to announce the possible political overtones, which surely involved the memorialization of those students, intellectuals, journalists, and citizens who peacefully demonstrated and were killed in June of 1989. The artist's breath is used as an artistic medium or material, as the life substance, as an ephemeral transformative principle. It could signify the continuous change and the philosophic tradition of Taoism, which has been so important in past centuries. Breath and mist also holds water within them, and therefore, as noted by the art historian David Clark, this connects this contemporary work to much older traditions of Chinese landscape painting, which used water and ink as its medium. And this was actually called shan shui, the mountain water painting. So it's ink diluted with water on a silk scroll. And within these landscape paintings, the tradition depicted the natural world, and in particular, aspects of the natural world that also had mists and streams and ponds and waterfalls. And if you look closely, you can see waterfalls, lakes, here are clouds and mists, and there are various streams flowing and waterways. So Dong Song's performance suggests the potential of one individual to enact the smallest, nearly imperceptible change in the urban environment, which has long been, this site, this square has long been quasi-sacred and ceremonial and political. And he did this with the idea of an imagined collective or a much larger national population in tension with this small individual gesture from his solitary body. The frost, if created, would have been fleeting and ostensibly useless. Unfortunately, the artist was not successful in creating any frost on the slabs of concrete or slate. In any case, if he had created frost, it would have been useless from a capitalist point of view and resist instrumentalization from an ideological point of view. The work is not commodifiable, not quantifiable, and hardly visible, and therefore resistant to any impulses to make a spectacle of it. But in this instance, art is important because of its symbolic transient overtones. It's all intentionality and potential. It's all about a possibility and the will to enact change, to remember those whose breath was stopped, those whose life force was eradicated. We can deduce that the artist's gesture was not only to remember the dead, but to protest the government's continued prohibition on remembering them and the goals they stood for, which continues so forcefully to this day that the date June 4th, 1989, as an internet search term in China is blocked every year. The state's prohibition of memorials and remembrance events for assassinated political opponents is a common strategy in many other countries, including the United States under the Trump government. Song's site-specific work is as activated by the cultural and political history as by the artist's body and his persistent acts of breathing. It is a work of mourning, memorial, but also hope. A pessimist might see the lack of frost buildup as a failure, while an optimist might see the work as important in its aspiration, in its transcendent way it travels through time and through various histories, through Chinese art and possibly politics. We cannot say for sure, as well as possibly connecting to other global causes for freedom. Now, if we turn to Dresden, Germany, in the winter months of 2017, we can see a spectacular, this is the square, and the monument that I'm about to show you exists just to the right. Can't find my cursor. Oh, there we go. Exists just behind this, where there is continued restoration of the square going on at this time, which was 2017. But here we see the monument and the historic church. So if we turn to Dresden, Germany in the winter months of 2017, we can see a spectacular memorial artwork that also functions in terms of site specificity, installed as it is in a historic square at the heart of the city's old center, which was rebuilt after its near total destruction at the end of World War II. Just move forward. Entitled Monument to Peace, Memorial for Aleppo, This work was created by the German Syrian artist Manaf Halbuni, who is now 36 years old. It was created with support from the German government, and the work addresses multiple wars in a layered and dialogical way. The installation of 3 upturned city buses functions in terms of its monumentality, its physical presence, in other words, its materiality, and the choice of objects turned into a public art monument, as well as the choice of objects, as well as its temporality or timing and its symbolism. Let's see, okay, we're not there yet. The most obvious reference is the Syrian War because of the title, which was in its 6th year when the work was installed. And the striking image of 3 buses being turned on their noses references the tactics to protect and block off certain parts of cities and neighborhoods in the Syrian cities where most of the fighting was happening, particularly Aleppo, but also Damascus and Homs, and of the resistors or rebels opposed to Assad's continued dictatorship. The rebels used such ad hoc measures and materials. We should remember how the Russian government supplied many of the arms used against the civilians of Syria, as well as chemical weapons, which were used repeatedly. Humanitarian workers, including bus convoys of NGO relief missions and aid workers, were actually targeted by missiles and destroyed, as were many white helmet rescue workers who were also killed by missile strikes on heavily populated cities. I think everybody knows this history quite well. Earlier than the Syrian civil war, however, there was the Cold War, the over 30-year block of time that had divided Germany from the building of the Berlin Wall starting in 1960 to its destruction in 1990, with Dresden located in the east, the communist-run DDR, or Deutsche Demokratische Republik. And the Cold War only ended in Germany technically with the reunification of 1990. Before this, of course, was the Second World War, if we want to go in reverse to all the conflicts that are referenced by this memorial. With the Second World War, towards the end of it was the devastating Allied bombing of Dresden, which was an attempt to end the war, which killed many, many civilians, as probably everybody knows, and destroyed much of the city of Dresden, including the very old Frauenkirche, or the Holy Ladies Church, whose ruins were memorialized and preserved without being rebuilt for about 50 years by the former East German government. The church's rebuilding only started in 1994 after reunification. And what we see here is the miraculous reconstruction of the salvaged, preserved stones and remains, which was completed in 2004. But we must go further back into history to see the potential for reconciliation that Halbuni's work entails. Because the Frauenkirche was initially a Catholic church built in the 11th century in a Romanesque style, and only later became an earlier version of the Protestant church we see today in the 16th century during the Reformation, which some might remember was a profoundly bloody sectarian religious conflict that lasted for many, many decades, well over a century, and left a trail of destruction across Europe. So centuries before the rebuilding of the church in the 1990s, the continued standing of it symbolized a measure of peace and respectful cohabitation among Catholics and Protestants, among co-residing populations who were previously enemies. So all of this may sound completely familiar or resonant of other conflicts happening right now in other places in the world. So the aesthetics of the Monument to Peace Memorial to Aleppo are interesting because of the enormous height of the three buses, which face the soaring ascendant verticality of the dome, which rises from the walls of the church. We could possibly read a Christian reference into the number of buses used, which is 3, linking the monument to the Holy Trinity. And Syria, all of the nations in the Middle East region are multi-faith and multi-ethnic, with existing very old Christian populations there. But, however, to read a facile, singular, or simple meaning into the memorial artwork would be a mistake. The 3 raised buses, whose ugly, if eviscerated, rusty underbellies are exposed, are also strangely suggest organs or charred carcasses. But such a ghastly analogy prevents the acknowledgement of the transcendence of the monument, which rises like human protesters or their fists against state-sponsored military injustice and senseless violence. Many questions remain about this epic artwork. However, with such a complex interplay of narratives, histories, and positions, for example, is the Monument to Peace Aleppo Memorial in its upright disposition facing the Frauenkirche, is it in alliance with, as a symbol of continued resilience and faith and the potential for reconciliation, is it in alliance with those things that the church once stood for, reconciliation and peace and living together? Is this uprightness mirroring the uprightness of the church? Does this speak to those same principles of peace and reconciliation? Or do the 3 buses rise up against the church, perhaps as an anti-colonial, anti-imperial refusal of the wars brought on by various Western ideologies and beliefs? Media interviews with the artist cite his continued emphasis on his own identity as both German and Syrian, without mention of any religious affiliation. So the artist himself holds the double view of a diasporic perspective of someone who was displaced because of war, whose Syrian friends have been killed, and whose former homeland and all of its associated cultural memories have been partially destroyed. This is significant in the context of the often alarming rising popularity, although not without counter protests, of the far-right political party AfD in Germany, which is virulently anti-immigration. And this party, this far-right party, AfD, is actually quite strong in Dresden. And they were quite opposed to this artistic monument. We should keep the artist's chosen title, the Monument to Peace, the Memorial for Aleppo, as the most important guide to our initial interpretations. And perhaps remember that 2 monuments facing each other are not necessarily in opposition to each other, nor even in alliance, but in some kind of dialogue with each other. Is it their site specificity that activates the dialogue, moreover? The most unlikely of encounters together in this preserved historic square. So we have layers of history. We have one site that brings together multiple other geographic locations. We have a history of violence and conflict. We have contemporary acknowledgement of violence and conflict. But in both cases, the architects, the church builders, and the artist seem to believe in remembering the dead and their value, and the Germans as well. Many people put these notes of sympathy and hope for peace, and the artists seem to raise these with an aspiration for intercultural dialogue and peace. So those key elements, I would say, connect with Acqui Enwezer's statements that introduced the Venice Biennial, which was one of the reading references that I provided to Dr. Nagy to disseminate for the group. Anyway, that ends my talk for the first part, and I hope it wasn't too long. So I will